The silence in that mahogany-paneled conference room was deafening. 23 family members sat around the polished table, their eyes avoiding mine as if I carried some contagious disease. The lawyer's voice had just delivered the words I'd been dreading. Unfortunately, Miss Charlotte Brennan is not mentioned in the will. But what happened next would turn my family's carefully constructed world upside down and reveal a secret that had been hidden for over 2 decades. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up as Charlotte Brennan meant growing up invisible. In a family where success was measured in dollar signs and social status, I was the disappointing anomaly. The adopted daughter who never quite fit the mold that my parents, Robert and Patricia Brennan, had envisioned. My adoptive parents were titans of Chicago's business community. Robert owned a chain of luxury car dealerships that stretched across 3 states, while Patricia had built her reputation as one of the city's most sought-after interior designers for the wealthy elite. Their biological children, my older brother Marcus and younger sister Victoria, had inherited not just their parents' ambition, but their ruthless approach to getting what they wanted. Marcus, at 35, had seamlessly stepped into the family business, expanding the dealership empire with the same calculating precision our father admired. Victoria, 28, had married into the prestigious Whitmore family, cementing her place in Chicago's high society while managing her own successful boutique marketing firm. Both were golden children who could do no wrong in Robert and Patricia's eyes. Then there was me, 31 years old, working as a paralegal at a small law firm downtown, living in a modest apartment in Lincoln Park rather than the sprawling estate that housed the rest of the Brennan clan. I had always been the family's quiet disappointment, the one they tolerated at holiday gatherings but never truly embraced. The adoption had never been a secret, but it had always been a source of subtle tension. Robert and Patricia had adopted me when I was 6 months old, after Patricia's difficult pregnancy with Victoria had left her unable to have more children. They'd wanted another child, but as I grew older, it became clear that their vision of family perfection didn't include a daughter who preferred books to business ventures, who chose helping others over climbing social ladders. Throughout my childhood, I'd felt the weight of their disappointment. While Marcus received praise for every small business achievement and Victoria was celebrated for her social connections, my academic accomplishments were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. When I graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in political science, Robert's response was a curt, "Good for you, Charlotte," before launching into a detailed discussion about Marcus's latest dealership acquisition. The distance between us had only grown wider over the years. Family dinners became exercises in endurance, where conversations flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. Marcus would discuss expansion plans with Robert, Victoria would share gossip from her country club circles with Patricia, and I would sit quietly picking at my food, counting the minutes until I could politely excuse myself. When Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, I had hoped that facing mortality might soften the family dynamics. I visited him in the hospital regularly, bringing books he never read and flowers he barely acknowledged. Patricia was always there, of course, orchestrating his care with military precision, while Marcus and Victoria took turns managing the business aspects of his treatment and estate planning. I wasn't included in those planning sessions. When I asked Patricia if there was anything I could do to help, she'd smile that tight, practiced smile and say, "Oh, Charlotte, you're so sweet, but we have everything handled." It was the same dismissive tone she'd used when I was 12 and had offered to help plan Victoria's birthday party, or when I was 16 and had suggested contributing to the family's charity fundraiser. The cancer moved quickly, and Robert's condition deteriorated faster than anyone had expected. In his final weeks, as he lay in the intensive care unit surrounded by machines and monitors, he seemed to look through me rather than at me. His last words to Marcus were about preserving the family legacy. His last words to Victoria were about being proud of the woman she'd become. His last words to me were barely audible. "Take care of yourself, Charlotte." He died on a cold February morning, and even in death, the family dynamics remained unchanged. Patricia handled the funeral arrangements with Victoria's help, while Marcus managed the business transition. I was informed of decisions after they'd been made. invited to events after the guest lists had been finalized. The funeral itself was a grand affair befitting Robert Brennan's status in the community, filled with politicians, business leaders, and society figures who spoke eloquently about his contributions and legacy. During the reception following the service, I overheard Patricia speaking with her sister Eleanor about the upcoming will reading. "Of course, it will just be family," Patricia had said, not noticing I was within earshot. Robert was very clear about his intention. He wanted to ensure the family assets would be properly managed by those who understood the business. The implication was clear. Even if the words weren't spoken directly, I wasn't considered capable of understanding or managing anything of significance. The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 o'clock at the offices of Cromwell, Sterling and Associates, the prestigious law firm that had handled the Brennan family's legal affairs for over 3 decades. The mahogany-paneled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower was familiar territory for Marcus and Victoria, who had both been involved in various business dealings that required legal consultation. For me, it was intimidating and foreign, despite my work in the legal field. Cromwell Sterling and Associates was the kind of firm that charged more for a single consultation than I made in a month. The receptionist's smile was professional but cool as she directed me to the conference room where my family was already assembled. Patricia sat at the head of the table opposite from where the lawyer would sit, dressed in an elegant black suit that probably cost more than my car. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless despite the recent loss of her husband. She had always been a woman who believed that appearances mattered above all else, and grief was no excuse for looking anything less than impeccable. Marcus sat to her right, his navy suit perfectly tailored, his dark hair slicked back in the same style Robert had favored. He had his father's strong jaw and calculating eyes, and at 35, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. His wife Jennifer sat beside him, a perfectly polished blonde, who had fit seamlessly into the Brennan family's social circle. Victoria occupied the seat to Patricia's left, wearing a charcoal gray dress that struck the perfect balance between morning attire and professional fashion. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her green eyes, so like Patricia's, surveyed the room with the same assessing gaze that had made her successful in her marketing career. Her husband David, heir to the Whitmore pharmaceutical fortune, sat beside her with the relaxed posture of a man born into wealth. The rest of the table was filled with extended family members, Robert's brother William and his wife Sarah, along with their twin sons Kevin and Keith, Patricia's sisters Eleanor and Margaret, with their respective spouses and children, and various cousins and their families who had maintained close relationships with Robert and Patricia over the years. I took the only remaining seat at the far end of the table opposite Patricia, feeling like an interloper at my own father's will reading. The conversations around me were subdued but warm, family members sharing memories of Robert and discussing practical matters related to his passing. No one addressed me directly, though a few offered polite nods when our eyes met. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened and James Cromwell himself entered the room. At 72, he was a distinguished man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been Robert's lawyer and friend for over 30 years, handling everything from business acquisitions to estate planning. He carried a leather briefcase and a thick manila folder that presumably contained the documents that would determine our family's future. "Good afternoon, everyone," Cromwell said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in high-stakes legal practice. "Thank you all for being here today. I know this is a difficult time for the family, and I want to express my personal condolences on the loss of Robert. He was not only a valued client but a good friend." He took his seat at the head of the table and opened the manila folder, revealing a stack of legal documents. "Before we begin with the formal reading, I want to explain the process. Robert's will is quite comprehensive, and there are several components we'll need to address today. The estate is substantial, and he was very specific about his wishes regarding the distribution of assets." Patricia nodded approvingly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his business instincts clearly engaged. Victoria maintained her composed expression, though I noticed her fingers drumming silently against the table, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "The will was last updated 6 months ago," Cromwell continued, and Robert was very thorough in his instructions. However, I must note that there are some unusual provisions that may come as a surprise to some of you. A subtle tension rippled through the room. Patricia's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, and Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Victoria. Cromwell began reading the formal language of the will, his voice steady and professional as he outlined the standard legal formality. He covered Robert's wishes for his funeral arrangements, which had already been carried out according to his specifications, and then moved on to the distribution of assets. The first bequests were exactly what everyone expected. Marcus would inherit the car dealership empire, along with a substantial cash settlement and the family's primary residence. Victoria would receive a significant trust fund, several investment properties, and the vacation home in Aspen. Patricia would maintain control of her design business and receive a generous widow's allowance that would ensure her comfortable lifestyle for the rest of her life. Various extended family members received smaller but still substantial bequests, enough to pay off mortgages, fund their children's college educations, or make significant improvements to their lives. The gifts were thoughtful and generous, reflecting Robert's understanding of each family member's needs and circumstances. As Cromwell read through each bequest, the recipients nodded with satisfaction and gratitude. This was exactly what they had expected, exactly what they had been planning for. The Brennan fortune was being distributed according to the family hierarchy that had been established over decades of carefully maintained relationships and demonstrated loyalty, and then Cromwell reached the end of the list. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The silence that followed was palpable. Every person in that room was doing the same calculation I was doing. My name had not been mentioned. Not once. Not for a token amount. Not for a sentimental keepsake. Not even for a charitable donation made in my honor. I felt the blood drain from my face as reality sank in. Robert Brennan, the man who had been my father for over 30 years, had written me completely out of his will. In the eyes of the law, in the final accounting of his life's relationships, I simply didn't exist. The lawyer's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Unfortunately, Miss Charlotte Brennan is not mentioned in the will. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. Unfortunately, Miss Charlotte Brennan is not mentioned in the will. James Cromwell's voice echoed in my mind as I sat frozen in that leather chair, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Around the table, the silence stretched for what felt like eternity but was probably only seconds. Then, like a dam bursting, the reactions began to flood in. I watched faces transform in real time, some showing genuine surprise, others barely concealing satisfaction, and a few displaying what might have been sympathy if I was feeling generous enough to interpret their expressions that way. Patricia was the first to speak, her voice carrying that familiar tone of practiced concern that had always made my skin crawl. "Oh, Charlotte. Dear." She reached across the table as if to touch my hand, but the gesture fell short, her fingers stopping just inches from mine. "I'm sure there's been some mistake. Robert always cared about you." But her eyes told a different story. There was no shock there, no confusion or outrage at what should have been an unthinkable oversight. Patricia knew. She had known this moment was coming, had probably helped orchestrate it. The way she avoided my direct gaze, the careful modulation of her voice, the practiced nature of her response, it all spoke of preparation, of conversations held in private where my fate had been decided without my knowledge or presence. Marcus cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe there's a separate document," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Dad was pretty thorough about these things. Could be something we haven't seen yet." His wife Jennifer placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, murmuring something about how these things happen and how families are complicated. But I caught the quick glance she exchanged with Victoria, a look that said they weren't surprised either. The inner circle had known what was coming, had discussed it among themselves, had perhaps even agreed it was for the best. Victoria, ever the diplomat, tried to inject some warmth into her voice. "Charlotte, I know this must be really difficult, but you know Dad always struggled with expressing his feelings. Maybe he thought, what exactly?" The words came out sharper than I intended, cutting through Victoria's careful attempt at comfort. The sound of my own voice surprised me. It carried a strength I didn't know I possessed in that moment. Maybe he thought I wasn't really family. Maybe he thought 30 years of calling him Dad wasn't enough to earn even a mention in his final wishes. The room went silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was uncomfortable, charged with the kind of tension that comes when someone speaks truths that everyone else has been carefully avoiding. Uncle William, Robert's brother, shifted in his seat and mumbled something about how Robert had always been particular about business matters. His wife Sarah shot him a warning look, clearly signaling that this wasn't the time for diplomatic explanations. Cromwell cleared his throat, his professional demeanor intact despite the obvious family tension. "If I may," he said, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations that had started around the table. "The will is quite clear and comprehensive. Robert spent considerable time reviewing every detail with me over the past year. These were his explicit wishes, and there are no additional documents or provisions that would alter what I've read here today." His words hit like a physical blow. There was no mistake, no oversight, no forgotten codicil tucked away in some safe deposit box. Robert Brennan had deliberately, methodically, comprehensively written me out of his life's final statement. After 30 years of being his daughter, of growing up in his house, of carrying his name, I had been reduced to nothing more than a legal nonentity. The meeting continued around me as if I had already disappeared. Cromwell began explaining the practical aspects of asset transfer, discussing tax implications and timeline requirements with Marcus and Victoria. Patricia asked detailed questions about maintaining control of her design business and the management of various investment accounts. Extended family members discussed their inheritances in hushed, grateful tones. I sat there like a ghost at my own funeral, watching my family plan their futures with money and assets that had once naively thought might include some consideration for me, not because I needed or wanted their wealth, but because some small part of me had believed that despite all the distance and disappointment, I was still family. I was still Robert Brennan's daughter, even if I had never lived up to his expectations. But the will had spoken the truth, that no one had been willing to say aloud during all those years of strained family dinners and polite but distant interactions. I wasn't family. I was a legal obligation they had fulfilled for 18 years, a social responsibility they had discharged, a mistake they had learned to tolerate but never embrace. Eleanor, Patricia's sister, leaned over to whisper something in my adoptive mother's ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Patricia nod, and then look in my direction with what she probably thought was sympathy, but looked more like the kind of pity one might show a stray animal. The meeting was winding down, with Cromwell explaining the next steps in the probate process and scheduling follow-up appointments with various family members to handle the transfer of specific assets. Marcus would need to meet with the dealership's corporate attorneys. Victoria would require consultation with tax specialists about her trust fund. Patricia had appointments scheduled to review her investment portfolio and update beneficiary information. No one mentioned any follow-up appointments for me because, of course, there was nothing to follow up on. As people began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, the conversations around me took on a different quality. Family members who had been seated near me started to drift toward other parts of the room, creating a subtle but unmistakable buffer zone. It was as if being excluded from the will had made me somehow contagious, as if acknowledging my presence might remind them of their own mortality or the fragility of their positions in the family hierarchy. Victoria approached me as I remained seated, her designer heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She had always been the more diplomatic of my adoptive siblings, the one who made efforts to include me in conversations and remember my birthday. But even her kindness had always felt calculated, performed more for her own sense of propriety than out of genuine affection. "Charlotte," she said, her voice soft and carefully controlled, "I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us. You're still my sister, And David and I want you to know you're always welcome in our home." The words should have been comforting, but they felt hollow. Victoria's idea of sisterhood had always been limited to holiday cards and occasional coffee dates, when it was convenient for her schedule. She had never been unkind, but she had never been truly warm either. Her gesture now felt more like charity than love, an attempt to assuage her own guilt rather than a genuine expression of family loyalty. "Thank you," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. "That's very kind of you." Marcus joined us, his expression uncertain. He had always been harder to read than Victoria, more like Robert in his tendency to keep his emotions carefully controlled. "Listen, Charlotte," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. I didn't know Dad was going to." He trailed off, apparently unable to find words that wouldn't sound either patronizing or admitting to prior knowledge he didn't want to acknowledge. "It's fine, Marcus," I said, standing up from my chair and gathering my purse and coat. "I understand. I'm not family. The will makes that pretty clear." "That's not," he began, but I was already walking toward the door. Patricia intercepted me near the conference room entrance, her perfectly manicured hand touching my arm with the lightest possible contact. "Charlotte, dear, why don't you come to dinner on Sunday? We're all going to be dealing with so much in the coming weeks, and it would be nice to have the family together." The invitation felt like salt in an open wound. After 30 years of being the afterthought at family gatherings, after being systematically excluded from every important decision and conversation, after being written out of Robert's will entirely, she wanted me to come to Sunday dinner and pretend nothing had changed. "I don't think so, Patricia," I said, using her first name rather than the mom I had called her throughout my childhood. The shift felt significant. Like crossing a bridge I would never be able to cross back. "I think it's probably better if I give everyone some space to process all of this." Her face tightened slightly at my use of her first name, but she maintained her composed exterior. "Well, you know you're always welcome," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. As I walked toward the elevator, I could hear the family members behind me resuming their conversations, their voices already lighter and more animated now that the uncomfortable moment of my exclusion had been addressed and dismissed. They were moving on, making plans, discussing logistics, embracing their futures with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged in the world. The elevator doors closed behind me, and for the first time since entering that conference room, I was alone. The silence felt different now, not oppressive, but clarifying. As the floors counted down toward the lobby, I began to understand something that had taken me 31 years to recognize. I had never actually been part of the Brennan family. I had been a visitor who had overstayed her welcome, a project that had been deemed unsuccessful, a reminder of plans that hadn't worked out the way everyone had hoped. The will hadn't revealed some shocking betrayal. It had simply documented a truth that had existed all along. By the time I reached the ground floor and stepped out into the busy Chicago afternoon, something fundamental had shifted inside me. The rejection still stung. The hurt was still raw and overwhelming, but underneath those feelings was something else. A strange sense of liberation. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I stood with the Brennan family. There were no more illusions to maintain, no more false hopes to nurture, no more energy to waste trying to earn a place that was never going to be offered. I was completely, utterly, finally free. The next few days passed in a surreal blur of routine, disrupted by moments of crushing realization. I went to work at Peterson and Associates, the small law firm where I'd been employed for the past 6 years, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But concentration proved impossible when every legal document I processed reminded me of the document that had just erased me from my family's future. My boss, Helen Peterson, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had built her practice from nothing, specializing in family law and estate planning. She noticed my distraction almost immediately when I made 3 filing errors in a single morning, something that had never happened in my entire tenure at the firm. "Charlotte," she said, appearing at my desk with the kind of direct approach that had made her successful in a competitive field. My office. Now. I followed her into the modest but well-organized space that served as both her private office and meeting room for clients who couldn't afford the marble and mahogany of firms like Cromwell, Sterling and Associates. Helen gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs across from her desk, then settled into her own chair with the focused attention of someone preparing to get to the bottom of a problem. "What's going on?" she asked without preamble. "You've been here 6 years, and I've never seen you make a single careless mistake. Today you've made 3 before lunch. Either you're having a breakdown, or something happened that you need to talk about." Helen had always been direct, but she had also been fair and surprisingly supportive during my time at the firm. When I'd needed time off to care for Robert during his illness, she had accommodated my schedule without question. When I'd expressed interest in eventually attending law school, she had offered to provide mentorship and recommendations. She was, I realized, more invested in my future than my own adoptive family had ever been. "My adoptive father died 2 weeks ago," I said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "The reading was yesterday. I wasn't included. Not a single mention, not a dollar, not even a personal item." Helen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't immediately respond. She had spent decades dealing with family disputes and inheritance battles, so she understood the devastating impact of will exclusions better than most people. 31 years, I continued, surprised by my own willingness to share details. 31 years of being Robert Brennan's daughter, and when it came time for his final statement about who mattered in his life, I might as well have been invisible. "Were you expecting to inherit?" Helen asked, her tone carefully neutral. "No," I admitted. "I mean, maybe something small. A token amount, or some personal keepsake. Something that acknowledged I existed, that I had been part of his life. But nothing. Complete exclusion." In the way my family reacted, it was clear they all knew it was coming. Helen leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her as she processed this information. "Charlotte, in my experience, complete exclusions are rarely accidental. They're usually the result of either deep family conflicts or very specific intentions on the part of the deceased. Was there bad blood between you and your adoptive father?" "That's just it," I said, feeling the frustration rise in my voice. "There wasn't any dramatic fight or major conflict. I was just never quite good enough. Never quite the daughter he wanted. I didn't go into the family business. I didn't marry into the right social circles. I didn't live up to their expectations of what a Brennan should be. But you maintained a relationship with them. I tried. I visited during his illness. I attended family functions. I called on birthdays and holidays. I thought," I paused, realizing how naive I sounded. "I thought that being consistent and present would count for something. I thought that even if I wasn't their ideal daughter, I was still their daughter." Helen was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the legal and emotional implications of what I had shared. Finally, she spoke again. "Charlotte, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you ever seen your adoption papers?" The question caught me off guard. "My adoption papers? No. Why would I need to see them? My parents always told me I was adopted when I was 6 months old. They said my birth mother was young and couldn't care for me, and that they were grateful to be able to give me a home. It was never a secret." "But you never saw the actual legal documents?" "No, it never occurred to me to ask. Why? What difference would it make?" Helen stood up and moved to the filing cabinet behind her desk, pulling out a blank legal pad and returning to her seat. "Charlotte, I've been practicing family law for 23 years, and I've handled hundreds of adoption cases. In my experience, adoptive parents who truly consider an adopted child to be their own don't make distinctions in their estate planning. Love is love, legally and emotionally." She began writing notes on the legal pad as she spoke. "The fact that you were completely excluded, combined with your family's apparent foreknowledge of that exclusion, suggests there might be more to your adoption story than you've been told." "What do you mean?" I mean that sometimes adoptions aren't as straightforward as they appear. Sometimes there are unusual circumstances, special arrangements, or legal complications that affect the long-term relationship between the adoptive parents and the child. My mind started racing through memories, looking for clues I might have missed. Had there been signs that my adoption was different from what I'd been told? Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, legal documents that were quickly put away when I was around, phone calls that were taken in private. What kind of complications? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Well, for instance, sometimes adoptions are arranged privately within families or social circles. Sometimes there are financial arrangements or ongoing obligations that affect the relationship. Sometimes the biological parents maintain some level of involvement or legal connection that the child isn't aware of. Helen paused, studying my face carefully. And sometimes, Charlotte, adoptions are arranged to solve problems rather than to create families. What does that mean? It means that occasionally, wealthy families adopt children not out of a desire for parenthood, but to address legal, financial, or social complications. The adoption provides legal protection or social cover for the adults involved, while the child grows up believing they're part of a loving family. The words hit me like cold water. You think my adoption was some kind of business arrangement? I think your adoption deserves closer examination, especially given what happened with the will. Charlotte, I'd like to help you get some answers. Would you be willing to let me do some research? What kind of research? First, I'd like to request copies of your adoption records from the state. Then I'd like to look into the Brennan family's legal history around the time of your adoption. If there were unusual circumstances, there would be a paper trail. I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to know the truth, but another part was terrified of what that truth might reveal. What if Helen was right? What if my entire understanding of my life and identity was based on lies? How long would this take? I asked. A few weeks, maybe less if we're lucky. I have good relationships with the clerks in several relevant offices, and I know how to navigate the bureaucracy efficiently. I thought about my family, probably meeting right now to discuss the division of assets and the handling of Robert's estate. I thought about Marcus stepping into his inheritance without question, Victoria planning how to manage her trust fund, Patricia arranging her comfortable widowhood. They were all moving forward with their lives, secure in their identities and their places in the world. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a small law office, discovering that everything I thought I knew about my origins might be a lie. What would it cost? I asked, practical concerns mixing with my emotional turmoil. Helen smiled. And for the first time since the will reading, someone looked at me with genuine warmth. Charlotte, you've been an excellent employee for 6 years. You've been reliable, intelligent, and dedicated. You've also been vastly overqualified for your position, and we both know it. Consider this a professional development opportunity. You mean you'd do this for free? I mean, I do this because I believe everyone deserves to know the truth about their life, and because I suspect that uncovering your real story might be more interesting than either of us imagines. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. Helen, do you know something you're not telling me? I don't know anything yet, she said, emphasizing the word yet. But Charlotte, I've been practicing law in Chicago for over 2 decades. The Brennan name isn't unfamiliar to me. Neither are the kinds of legal complications that wealthy families sometimes create for themselves. What does that mean? It means that Robert Brennan's sudden decision to completely exclude his adopted daughter from his will might not be as sudden as it appears. It might be the final step in covering up something that happened 31 years ago. She looked at me directly, her expression serious but not unkind. Charlotte, are you prepared for the possibility that everything you've been told about your adoption might be false? Are you ready to discover who you really are? I sat in that small office, surrounded by law books and filing cabinets, and realized that I was standing at a crossroads. I could walk away, accept the family's rejection, and move forward with my life as Charlotte Brennan, The unwanted adopted daughter, or I could step into the unknown and discover what secrets had been buried for over 3 decades. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I want to know the truth. Helen nodded and made a note on her legal pad. Then, let's find out who Charlotte Brennan really is. Helen Peterson worked faster than I had expected. Within a week, she had managed to obtain my adoption records from the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, along with several other documents that painted a very different picture of my origins than the simple story I had grown up believing. She called me into her office on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of Chicago weather that made everything feel muted and uncertain. When I walked in, her desk was covered with manila folders, photocopied documents, and yellow legal pads covered in her precise handwriting. The expression on her face was a mixture of excitement and concern that immediately made my stomach tighten with anticipation. "Sit down, Charlotte," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We need to talk about what I've found." I settled into the familiar chair, my hands already trembling slightly. "Is it bad?" "It's complicated," Helen replied, picking up one of the folders and opening it carefully. "Let's start with what you were told about your adoption versus what actually happened." She pulled out a document and placed it in front of me. It was my adoption decree, dated 31 years ago, but as I scanned the official legal language, several details jumped out that contradicted the story I had always known. "According to your adoption records," Helen began, "you weren't adopted when you were 6 months old. You were adopted when you were 3 years old." The words didn't immediately make sense. "That's impossible. I don't remember anything before living with the Brennans." "How could I have been 3? "Keep reading," Helen said, pointing to a section of the document. "Your birth name wasn't Charlotte. It was Emma Catherine Morrison." Emma Catherine Morrison. The name felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like trying to remember a dream that had almost faded completely. I stared at the document, trying to process this fundamental shift in everything I thought I knew about myself. "Morrison," I repeated slowly. I don't understand. If I was 3 when I was adopted, why don't I remember anything? Why don't I remember being Emma Morrison?" Helen's expression grew more serious. "That's where things get really interesting, Charlotte. Or should I say Emma?" She pulled out another document. This one from a private medical practice. "According to these records, you were hospitalized for several weeks just before your adoption. The medical notes indicate severe trauma and what the doctors called selective amnesia related to a traumatic incident." My hands went cold as I stared at the medical records. The clinical language described a 3-year-old child who had been found in a state of shock, unable or unwilling to speak, suffering from what would now probably be diagnosed as severe PTSD. "What kind of trauma?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The records are deliberately vague," Helen said, flipping through several pages. "But there are references to a family tragedy and ongoing investigation. What's more interesting is what happened after your hospitalization." She produced another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of Cromwell, Sterling and Associates, the same law firm that had handled Robert's will reading. "James Cromwell himself handled your adoption," Helen continued. "But this wasn't a typical adoption proceeding. The usual home studies, waiting periods, and family evaluations were all waived. The adoption was fast-tracked through the system with what appears to have been significant legal pressure from multiple parties." I felt like I was listening to someone else's story, not my own life history. Who were the other parties? That's where it gets even more complicated. Helen opened another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings that were yellowed with age. "I did some digging into Chicago news archives from 31 years ago, looking for any stories about the Morrison family." She handed me a newspaper clipping, and my breath caught in my throat as I read the headline, "Prominent attorney dies in apparent murder-suicide, daughter missing." The article was brief but chilling. Daniel Morrison, a successful criminal defense attorney, had apparently killed his wife Catherine in their Lincoln Park home before turning the gun on himself. Their 3-year-old daughter Emma had been found 3 days later by police, hiding in a closet, severely traumatized and unable to provide coherent information about what she had witnessed. "That's me," I whispered, staring at the grainy newspaper photo of a house I didn't recognize. "I was the missing daughter." "It gets worse," Helen said gently. Daniel Morrison wasn't just any criminal defense attorney. He was representing several high-profile clients in organized crime cases. According to these articles, the police investigated whether his death was actually a murder made to look like a murder-suicide. She handed me another clipping. This one from a few weeks later. "Morrison case closed without resolution. Child placed in protective custody. The investigation was dropped," Helen explained. "Officially, the case was ruled a murder-suicide and closed. Daniel Morrison was blamed for killing his wife and himself, leaving their daughter orphaned. But there were several reporters who questioned that conclusion. Why? Because Daniel Morrison was left-handed, but the gun was found in his right hand. Because there were no powder burns on his hands consistent with firing the weapon. Because several witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood that night." Helen's voice took on the tone of someone who had spent years analyzing legal evidence. Everything about the official conclusion was questionable. My mind was reeling as I tried to process this information. "So, you think my biological father was murdered?" "I think your biological parents were both murdered, and you were the only witness," Helen said bluntly. "I think someone very powerful wanted the case to disappear, and adopting you into a family that could be trusted to keep you quiet was part of covering up the truth." The pieces were starting to fall into place in a horrifying way. "The Brennans," I said slowly, "they weren't adopting me because they wanted another child. They were adopting me to keep me silent about what I might have seen." "That's my theory," Helen confirmed. "And I think Robert Brennan knew exactly what he was agreeing to when he took you in. The question is whether he was involved in the original crime, or just in the cover-up." She pulled out one final document. This one a financial record from a private investigator's report. "I hired someone to look into the financial connections between the Morrison case and the Brennan family. What we found is very interesting." The document showed a complex web of business relationships and financial transactions. Daniel Morrison had been investigating a money laundering operation that involved several of Robert Brennan's car dealerships. The night Morrison and his wife were killed, he had been preparing to present evidence to federal prosecutors that would have implicated not just organized crime figures, but several prominent Chicago businessmen who had been helping them clean their money. "Robert Brennan was one of the businessmen Morrison was investigating," I said, reading through the financial analysis. "Exactly. And 3 days after Morrison's death, federal agents raided his office and found that all of his files related to the money laundering investigation had been destroyed in a convenient fire." The room felt like it was spinning around me. Everything I had believed about my life, my family, my identity was collapsing and reforming into something darker and more complex than I could have imagined. "So Robert and Patricia didn't adopt me out of love or even charitable impulses," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant. "They adopted me because I was a potential threat to their criminal enterprise." "That's what the evidence suggests," Helen said. "They took in the traumatized daughter of the man who was about to expose their crimes, gave you a new identity, and raised you in an environment where you would never question the official story of what happened to your biological parents. And the memory loss? Could be a natural trauma response, could be medically induced, or could be a combination of both. What matters is that it served their purposes perfectly. You grew up believing you were Charlotte Brennan, the adopted daughter of a respectable businessman, with no memory of being Emma Morrison, the daughter of a murdered whistleblower." I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Helen had uncovered. My entire identity had been a lie designed to protect the people who had destroyed my real family. "There's one more thing," Helen said, her voice softer now. "I think I know why Robert excluded you from his will so completely." "Why?" "Because he was afraid. The money laundering investigation may have been buried 31 years ago, but there's no statute of limitations on murder. If you ever discovered the truth about your origins and decided to pursue justice for your biological parents, you could destroy not just Robert's legacy, but the entire criminal network he was part of. So excluding me from the will was his final attempt to keep me powerless and insignificant, I said, understanding flooding through me. Exactly. As long as you remain Charlotte Brennan, the disappointing adopted daughter with no resources and no family support, you posed no threat to anyone. But if you ever discovered that you were Emma Morrison, heir to your biological father's law practice and holder of potentially explosive information about unsolved murders. Helen didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood now why I had always felt like an outsider in the Brennan family. I understood why they had never truly embraced me, never made me feel like I belonged. I wasn't their daughter. I was their captive, their insurance policy against the truth ever coming to light. But now the truth was coming to light anyway. Helen, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. I want to know everything. I want to find out exactly what happened to my biological parents, and I want to make sure everyone responsible for their deaths faces justice. She smiled, and for the first time since this investigation began, she looked genuinely excited. I was hoping you'd say that, Emma, because I think we're just getting started. Helen's investigation had opened a door that couldn't be closed, but walking through it required more than just knowing the truth about my past. It required understanding what Emma Morrison had inherited beyond trauma and stolen memories. Over the next several days, Helen and I dove deeper into the legal labyrinth surrounding my biological father's estate, and what we discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my current situation. Daniel Morrison was more than just a successful criminal defense attorney, Helen explained as we sat in her office surrounded by bankers' boxes full of documents she had retrieved from various sources. He was also a brilliant legal strategist who apparently suspected he was in danger. She opened a thick folder containing documents from a storage facility in downtown Chicago. 3 weeks before his death, your father rented a private storage unit under a false name. The rental was paid for 30 years in advance, with instructions that if he died, the unit was to be transferred to his daughter Emma Catherine Morrison on her 30th birthday. My hands shook as I realized the implications. You mean there's been a storage unit waiting for me for over a year? Not just waiting for you, Helen said, pulling out a set of keys and a legal document. Legally belonging to you. The storage facility has been trying to contact Emma Morrison for the past year. But of course, Emma Morrison didn't exist in any public records because she had become Charlotte Brennan. The drive to the storage facility felt surreal. After 30 years of believing I was someone else, I was about to reclaim property that belonged to my true identity. The facility was in an older part of downtown, the kind of industrial building that housed small businesses and personal storage for people who didn't have enough space in their homes. The manager, an elderly man named Frank, who had worked there for over 40 years, led us through the maze of hallways to Unit 209. I remember when this unit was rented, he told us as we walked. Young man, very serious, very specific about the instructions. He said someday his daughter would come for what he left, and that she'd need it to set things right. The storage unit was larger than I had expected, about the size of a small bedroom, and it was meticulously organized. File cabinets lined one wall, while bankers' boxes were stacked neatly along another. A desk sat in the center of the space with a sealed envelope on top marked for Emma. When you're ready for the truth. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. My father's handwriting was neat and precise. The words of a man who knew he was running out of time. My dearest Emma, the letter began. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer alive to protect you and your mother. I pray that you have grown up safe and loved, but I suspect that the people responsible for our family's destruction have found a way to control your life, even in my absence. I had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the strange experience of hearing my father's voice for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Helen placed a supportive hand on my shoulder as I composed myself and continued. I have spent the last 6 months documenting a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Chicago's business and political communities. The evidence I have gathered proves that several prominent citizens, including Robert Brennan, have been using legitimate businesses to launder money for organized crime families. More importantly, I have proof that this conspiracy has involved murder, extortion, and corruption of public officials. The letter went on to explain that Daniel Morrison had been planning to turn over his evidence to federal prosecutors, but had realized that some of those prosecutors might also be compromised. Instead, he had decided to hide the evidence until he could find trustworthy authorities to handle the case. "Everything you need to bring these people to justice is in this storage unit," the letter continued. "Financial records, recorded conversations, photographs, and witness statements that prove the scope of this criminal enterprise. But Emma, I must warn you, pursuing this will put you in danger. These people have already proven they will kill to protect their secrets." The letter concluded with words that brought tears to my eyes. "You are my daughter, and I love you more than my own life. Whatever you decide to do with this information, know that you have the strength and intelligence to see it through. You are Emma Catherine Morrison, daughter of Daniel and Catherine Morrison, and no one can take that away from you." Helen and I spent the rest of the afternoon going through the contents of the storage unit. What we found was more comprehensive than either of us had imagined. Daniel Morrison had assembled a federal case that would have destroyed dozens of careers and sent multiple people to prison for life. The financial records alone were staggering. Detailed spreadsheets showed how money from drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and extortion had been funneled through Robert Brennan's car dealerships, then moved through a network of shell companies, and eventually invested in legitimate real estate and business ventures. The operation had generated hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, with Robert Brennan taking substantial fees for his role in the money laundering process. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. Recorded conversations revealed a network of corruption that included judges, prosecutors, police officials, and city council members. People who were supposed to protect the public had been bought and paid for by the criminal organization that Robert Brennan served. Most damning of all were the recordings that Daniel Morrison had made of his meetings with federal agents who were supposed to be investigating the money laundering operation. It became clear that some of those agents had been feeding information back to the criminals, warning them when raids were planned, and helping them stay one step ahead of legitimate law enforcement. "Emma," Helen said, using my real name as she reviewed a particularly explosive set of documents, "this isn't just evidence of the crimes that got your parents killed. This is evidence of an ongoing criminal conspiracy that has been operating for over 30 years. She was right. The storage unit didn't just contain historical evidence, it contained proof that the criminal network had continued operating and expanding long after my parents' deaths. Robert Brennan's car dealership empire had grown dramatically over the years, and according to the financial patterns Daniel Morrison had identified, it was likely that the money laundering operation had grown along with it. Which means, I said, understanding the implications, that when Robert died, he left behind an active criminal enterprise that Marcus has probably inherited along with the legitimate businesses." "Exactly. And if Marcus doesn't know about the criminal side of the operation, he's about to become an unwitting participant in money laundering. If he does know, then he's already a criminal." As we continued reviewing the evidence, another disturbing pattern emerged. Several people who had been scheduled to testify in cases that Daniel Morrison was building had died in accidents or disappeared entirely in the months following my parents' deaths. The criminal organization hadn't just killed my parents, they had systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to their operation. "They've been cleaning house for 30 years, Helen observed, reading through police reports and newspaper clippings. "Anyone who got too close to the truth ended up dead or discredited. But there was one piece of evidence that changed everything we thought we knew about the current situation. Hidden in the back of one of the file cabinets was a sealed envelope marked "Insurance Policy, open only if Daniel Morrison dies under suspicious circumstances." Inside was a contract that made my blood run cold. It was an agreement between Daniel Morrison and James Cromwell, the lawyer who had handled my adoption and Robert's estate. According to the contract, if anything happened to Daniel Morrison, Cromwell would ensure that Emma Morrison was placed with a family that could be trusted to keep her safe and silent. In exchange, Cromwell would receive a substantial fee and ongoing legal business from the criminal organization. "Cromwell wasn't just the lawyer who handled my adoption," I said, staring at the contract in disbelief. "He was part of the conspiracy from the beginning. He helped place me with the Brennans, knowing exactly why they wanted me. But the biggest shock was yet to come. At the bottom of the insurance policy envelope was a deed, a property deed that had been signed over to Emma Catherine Morrison 3 days before Daniel Morrison's death. Helen examined the deed carefully, her eyes widening as she read the details. "Emma," she said slowly, "according to this document, your father transferred ownership of his law firm to you before he died. Morrison and Associates wasn't just your father's practice, it's been your law firm for 31 years. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. What does that mean? It means that when James Cromwell took over your father's practice after his death, he was essentially stealing your property. It means that Cromwell, Sterling and Associates has been operating illegally for 3 decades, using assets that legally belong to you. I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had shaped my entire life, and realized that the will reading that had seemed like the final insult from my adoptive family was actually the beginning of my transformation from victim to victor. "Helen," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, "I think it's time to reclaim what's mine." She smiled, and I could see the excitement of a legal battle building in her eyes. "Emma Morrison," she said, "you're not just the key witness to a 30-year-old murder case. You're the rightful owner of one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. And I think it's time everyone found out." Armed with 30 years of evidence, and the legal documentation proving my ownership of what had become Cromwell, Sterling and Associates, Helen and I began planning what she called the most satisfying legal maneuver of my career. But before we could reclaim my law firm, we needed to ensure that James Cromwell and his partners couldn't destroy evidence or transfer assets once they realized what was happening. Helen had connections throughout Chicago's legal community, and she used them strategically. Her first call was to Judge Patricia Hendricks, a federal judge who had a reputation for being both brilliant and incorruptible. Judge Hendricks had been appointed to the bench only 5 years earlier. Well, the events that had destroyed my family, which meant she had no connection to the original conspiracy. "Patricia," Helen said during their phone conversation, which she conducted on speaker so I could hear both sides, "I need an emergency meeting. I have evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving several prominent attorneys, and I believe there's an immediate risk of evidence destruction." Judge Hendricks agreed to see us that evening at her chambers. The federal courthouse felt imposing and official as Helen and I carried boxes of evidence through the security checkpoints and up to the judge's private office. Judge Hendricks was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything with judicial precision. "Miss Peterson," she said, gesturing for us to sit at the conference table in her chambers, "you mentioned evidence of a criminal conspiracy. I hope you're not wasting my time with civil litigation disguised as criminal matters." "Your Honor," Helen replied, opening the first box of documents, "what we have here is evidence of a criminal enterprise that has been operating for over 30 years, involving money laundering, murder, corruption of public officials, and theft of legal assets totaling millions of dollars." Over the next 2 hours, Helen presented Judge Hendricks with a carefully organized summary of everything we had discovered. The financial records showing the money laundering operation, the recorded conversations proving corruption of law enforcement and judicial officials, the evidence of my parents' murder and the subsequent cover-up, and finally, the documentation proving that I was the rightful owner of Cromwell, Sterling and Associates. Judge Hendricks listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. When Helen finished her presentation, the judge sat quietly for several minutes, reviewing key documents and considering the implications. "Miss Morrison," she said finally, using my real name for the first time in an official capacity, "do you understand that pursuing this case will put you in considerable danger? The people involved in this conspiracy have already proven they're willing to commit murder to protect their interests." "I understand, Your Honor," I replied, "but they've already taken everything from me. My parents, my identity, my childhood, my family. I won't let them keep what rightfully belongs to me, and I won't let them continue destroying other people's lives." Judge Hendricks nodded approvingly. Very well. I'm going to issue several emergency orders tonight. First, I'm granting a temporary restraining order, freezing all assets of Cromwell, Sterling and Associates pending resolution of this ownership dispute. Second, I'm ordering federal marshals to secure the law firm's offices and prevent any removal or destruction of documents. Third, I'm authorizing the FBI to begin an immediate investigation into the criminal conspiracy allegations. She paused, looking directly at me. And fourth, I'm issuing an emergency order recognizing your claim to ownership of Morrison and Associates, which means that as of tomorrow morning, you will have the legal authority to take control of the law firm that has been operating under stolen assets for 30 years. The next morning felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Helen and I arrived at the Willis Tower at 8 o'clock, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and an FBI agent named Detective Sarah Walsh. The lobby of the prestigious building looked the same as it had during Robert's will reading, but everything else was about to change dramatically. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt both eternal and too short. I was about to confront the people who had orchestrated the destruction of my family and stolen my inheritance. But I was also about to reclaim power that I had never known I possessed. The reception area of Cromwell, Sterling and Associates, was already busy with morning activity when we arrived. The elegant receptionist who had greeted me so coolly during the will reading looked up with confusion as our group approached her desk. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Cromwell is in a meeting," she began. But Detective Walsh interrupted her by displaying his badge and federal warrant. "Ma'am, this office is now under federal investigation and temporary federal protection. I need you to step away from your desk and not touch any phones or computers." The commotion drew attention from other areas of the office, and within minutes James Cromwell himself appeared in the reception area. At 72, he still carried himself with the authoritative bearing that had made him successful. But I could see confusion and the beginning of fear in his eyes as he took in the scene. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the imperious tone of someone accustomed to being in control. "I'll have your badges for this harassment." Helen stepped forward, holding a folder containing the federal court orders. "Mr. Cromwell, I'm Helen Peterson, attorney for Emma Catherine Morrison. I'm here to serve you with several federal court orders, including a restraining order freezing all assets of this firm and an emergency order recognizing Miss Morrison's rightful ownership of this law practice." Cromwell's face went pale as he processed Helen's words. His eyes darted between Helen, the federal agents, and me, and I could see the moment when he realized who I was. "Charlotte Brennan," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma Morrison," I corrected, my voice stronger and clearer than it had been in years. "Daughter of Daniel and Catherine Morrison, and rightful owner of Morrison and Associates." The sound of my real name, spoken in that office, seemed to reverberate through the space like a physical force. Other attorneys and staff members had gathered to watch the proceedings, and I could see recognition and fear spreading across several faces as they began to understand what was happening. Cromwell's composure cracked completely. "This is impossible," he stammered. "You can't. There's no legal basis for—" "Actually, there's a very solid legal basis," Helen interrupted, handing him the court orders. "Your firm has been operating illegally for 30 years, using assets that were fraudulently obtained through the murder of Daniel Morrison and the theft of his law practice. As of this moment, Emma Morrison is assuming control of what is rightfully hers." Detective Walsh stepped forward with additional documents. "Mr. Cromwell, you're also being served with a federal subpoena requiring you to appear before a grand jury investigating charges of conspiracy, money laundering, accessory to murder, and theft of legal assets." The next several hours were a whirlwind of activity as federal agents secured the office and began cataloging evidence. Helen and I established ourselves in what had been Cromwell's private office, which was technically my office now, and began the process of taking control of the firm's operations. The most dramatic moment came when Marcus and Victoria arrived at the law firm, apparently summoned by Cromwell in a desperate attempt to get help from the Brennan family. They entered the office with the confidence of people who expected to be treated with deference and respect, but stopped short when they saw me sitting behind Cromwell's desk. "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" Victoria asked, her perfectly composed exterior showing cracks of confusion and concern. I'm taking control of my law firm, I replied calmly. My name is Emma Morrison, and this has been my property for 31 years. Marcus stepped forward, his business instincts clearly trying to assess the situation. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is ridiculous. You can't just walk into someone's office and claim you own it. Helen handed him a copy of the court orders and the original deed transferring ownership of Morrison and Associates to me. Actually, Mr. Brennan, that's exactly what she can do when the office was built on stolen assets, and the legal documentation proves her rightful ownership. I watched my adoptive siblings read through the documents, seeing their expressions change from confusion to disbelief, to dawning horror as they began to understand the implications. Not only had they excluded me from Robert's will, but they had done so while I was actually the rightful owner of assets worth far more than anything Robert had left them. This can't be legal, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's not only legal, it's justice, I replied. Your father and this law firm conspired to murder my parents and steal my inheritance. Now I'm taking back what was always mine. Victoria sank into one of the office chairs, the weight of the revelations clearly overwhelming her. Charlotte, Emma, I don't understand. If this is true, why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you fight for this years ago? Because I didn't know, I said, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger toward the siblings who had grown up as my family while living off the proceeds of my parents' murder. I spent 30 years believing I was Charlotte Brennan, the unwanted adopted daughter. It wasn't until your father excluded me from his will that I started investigating my real origins. Marcus was staring at the documents in his hands, and I could see him doing calculations, probably trying to figure out how much money his family had made over the years from their connection to the stolen law firm. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now, Helen said, the federal investigation proceeds. The people responsible for Daniel and Catherine Morrison's murders will finally face justice, and Emma Morrison will decide what to do with the law firm and assets that have been illegally used for 30 years. I looked at Marcus and Victoria, these people who had been my siblings, but who were also beneficiaries of the crime that had destroyed my real family. What happens now is that the truth finally comes out. All of it. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Robert Brennan's will had been read, but everything had changed. The mahogany table that had once hosted my family's rejection now served as the command center for the most comprehensive federal investigation into organized crime that Chicago had seen in decades. The nameplate on the door no longer read, Cromwell, Sterling and Associates. It now bore the original name, Morrison and Associates. The federal investigation had moved swiftly once Judge Hendricks authorized it. Detective Sarah Walsh and her team had discovered that the criminal network my father had been investigating 30 years ago had grown into a vast enterprise spanning multiple states. Robert Brennan's car dealerships had served as just one component of a money laundering operation that had processed over $2 billion in illegal funds over 3 decades. James Cromwell had been the first to break under federal pressure. Faced with charges that could have resulted in life imprisonment, he had agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony had been devastating, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy and providing the final pieces of evidence needed to bring down the entire network. Emma, Detective Walsh said, entering the conference room with the latest update. We just got word from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The grand jury has returned indictments against 47 defendants, including 3 sitting judges, 2 federal prosecutors, the former police chief, and 5 city settlement members. The scope of the corruption had been staggering. The criminal organization had essentially purchased protection at every level of law enforcement and government, ensuring that their operations could continue without interference. My father's investigation had threatened to expose the entire system, which was why they had been willing to commit murder to stop him. What about the Brennan family? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Marcus Brennan has been charged with money laundering and conspiracy, Detective Walsh replied. The evidence shows he was actively involved in the illegal financial operations for the past 5 years, since he took over management of the dealerships. He claims he didn't know the money was illegal, but the financial records suggest otherwise. Marcus had tried to maintain his innocence, claiming that Robert had never told him about the criminal side of the business. But federal forensic accountants had traced his direct involvement in transactions that could only have been money laundering operations. His cooperation with the investigation had been minimal, apparently believing that his family's wealth and connections would somehow protect him from consequences. Victoria Brennan has not been charged with any crimes, Detective Walsh continued. Her marketing firm appears to have been completely legitimate, with no connection to the criminal enterprise. However, she has agreed to testify about her father's activities and the family's knowledge of your true identity. Victoria had been devastated by the revelations about Robert's criminal activities and the truth about my origins. Unlike Marcus, she had immediately cooperated with the investigation, providing testimony about family conversations she had overheard over the years. She had also been the one to reveal that Patricia had known about my true identity from the beginning. Patricia Brennan has been charged as an accessory after the fact, Detective Walsh said. She wasn't involved in the original murders, but she actively participated in the cover-up and helped maintain the deception about your identity for 30 years. Patricia's arrest had been the most satisfying moment of the entire investigation. The woman who had spent decades making me feel unwanted and inferior had been led away in handcuffs, her perfect composure finally cracking as she faced the consequences of her actions. Her claims that she had been trying to protect me by keeping me ignorant of the truth had fallen on deaf ears with the federal prosecutors. The financial restitution alone had been overwhelming. The federal court had ordered the seizure of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise, including the Brennan family's entire fortune. Marcus and Victoria had lost everything: the dealerships, the family home, their trust funds, even their personal bank accounts. Everything they had built their lives on had been purchased with blood money. But the most significant development had been the expansion of Morrison & Associates. With the criminal investigation complete and my ownership firmly established, I had made the decision to rebuild my father's law firm as a beacon of justice, rather than corruption. Helen Peterson had agreed to become my partner, and together we had recruited attorneys who specialized in fighting the kind of corruption that had destroyed my family. "There's one more update," Detective Walsh said, her expression becoming more serious. The forensic team found additional evidence in Robert Brennan's personal safe. It appears that he kept detailed records of every illegal transaction and criminal act the organization committed over the past 30 years. She handed me a thick folder marked confidential federal evidence. Inside were Robert's personal notes, written in his precise handwriting, documenting murders, bribes, threats, and cover-ups spanning 3 decades. It was a comprehensive record of his criminal life, kept perhaps as insurance against his partners, or as a twisted form of pride in his accomplishments. Why would he keep all of this? I asked, flipping through pages of damning evidence that Robert had essentially compiled against himself. According to the psychological profile, criminals like Robert Brennan often keep trophies or records of their crimes. Detective Walsh explained, they see themselves as successful business operators, and they want documentation of their achievements. It never occurred to him that this evidence would eventually be used to destroy everything he built. Among Robert's records was a detailed account of the night my parents were murdered. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but he had been present during the planning meeting where the decision was made to eliminate my father. The records showed that Robert had specifically suggested making it look like a murder-suicide to avoid a lengthy investigation. Most chilling of all was Robert's analysis of what to do with me after my parents' deaths. He had written detailed notes about the advantages of adopting me rather than having me placed in foster care or with other relatives. Keeping me close allowed them to monitor any recovery of memories, control my access to information about my parents, and ensure that I would never pose a threat to their operation. He planned my entire life, I said, reading through his cold, calculating assessment of a traumatized 3-year-old child. Every decision about my upbringing was designed to keep me powerless and ignorant, but Robert had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He had assumed that I would always remain the frightened, confused child who had been found hiding in a closet. He had never anticipated that I would grow into someone capable of fighting back, or that his final act of excluding me from his will would be the catalyst that exposed his entire criminal empire. The trial proceedings had been a media sensation, with coverage of the Morrison family murders dominating Chicago news for months. The story of the little girl who had been adopted by her parents' killers, only to grow up and bring down their criminal empire, had captured national attention. But for me, the most meaningful moments had come, not in the courtroom, but in the quiet work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Morrison and Associates was now specializing in cases involving government corruption, organized crime, and family law for people who couldn't afford high-priced legal representation. We were using the resources that had been stolen from my family to fight for justice for other families who had been victimized by powerful criminals. Helen had insisted on creating a memorial wall in our offices, featuring photographs and brief biographies of Daniel and Catherine Morrison. Seeing my parents' faces every day served as a reminder of why we were fighting and what we were fighting for. The personal reconciliation had been more complicated. Marcus remained unrepentant, claiming that he was a victim of his father's crimes rather than a participant. His refusal to accept responsibility had made any relationship between us impossible. He was facing 15 years in federal prison, and his wife Jennifer had filed for divorce and moved back to her family's home in California. Victoria had been different. The revelation of the truth about our family had shattered her understanding of her own life, but it had also opened the possibility for a genuine relationship between us for the first time. She had lost her inheritance and her social status, but she had gained something more valuable: the opportunity to build a relationship based on truth rather than lies. "Emma," she had said during one of our conversations, "I know I can never undo the 30 years of believing lies about you and our family, but I want you to know that I'm proud to be your sister. Your real sister, not the role I was playing in Robert's scheme." The financial settlement from the federal seizures had left me wealthier than I could have imagined, but wealth had never been the point. The point had been justice for my parents, accountability for their killers, and the reclamation of my true identity. As I sat in my father's restored office, looking out at the Chicago skyline from the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower, I thought about the journey that had brought me from that devastating will reading to this moment of triumph. Robert Brennan had intended his will to be his final insult, his last attempt to keep me powerless and insignificant. Instead, it had been the key that unlocked everything. By excluding me so completely, by making it so clear that I was not considered family, he had forced me to question everything I believed about my life. That questioning had led to the investigation that revealed my true identity and brought down his entire criminal empire. The intercom on my desk buzzed, and my assistant's voice announced that my next client had arrived. Morrison and Associates was thriving, representing families who had been victimized by corrupt officials, helping witnesses find the courage to testify against criminal organizations, and ensuring that the kind of justice my parents had been denied was available to others. I straightened my shoulders and prepared to meet with another family whose lives had been shattered by corruption and crime. Emma Morrison had work to do. The little girl who had been found hiding in a closet 31 years ago had finally found her way home, and now, from the law firm that should have been hers all along, she was making sure that other families would never have to endure what the Morrisons had suffered. Justice, it turned out, was worth the wait. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.